My name is Jane Caputi, and I'm a professor at Florida Atlantic University. I teach women, gender, and sexuality studies. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you today is drawn from this book that I published in 2020 called Call Your Mother, a deliberately dirty-minded manifesto for the Earth Mother in the Anthropocene. But okay, so let's go on. Next one. I'm going to say next because somebody's helping me. First thing I want to acknowledge is that I'm here in Boca Raton, Florida, and that these are basically the occupied homelands of the Tequesta and Seminole nations. And the Seminole were forcibly removed from Florida, put on boats, and put out to Oklahoma over several decades, but some escaped and formed the basis of the Seminole people in Florida today. Okay, thank you. Next. Whenever I'm thinking of political movements, I really love slogans and like what people come up with. I'm not that good at this, but sometimes they're really punchy, but they always get they distill it just down. And I thought it would be interesting to just look at some of the most, what I see as very meaningful signs held at, like climate emergency now, right? This is imperiling and killing people and species right now, right? Climate change is happening now. It's not going to happen down the road. It is happening now. And that what the climate justice movement says is that we need radical system change, all the systems, not climate change, and that they're all interconnecting systems of injustice. And of course, in 2012, the march, no climate justice without gender justice, that gender justice is absolutely foundational, as is racial justice. And of course, all forms of justice to the attempt to both mitigate and stop climate change. I mean, eventually. Okay, next. We hear like feminists demand climate justice. It's not, climate justice is broad. We can talk about it more later, but it basically acknowledges it's not humans doing this. Humans are not responsible. That it's actually, the elite and the wealthy nations and systemic white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism that is creating this climate crisis. And that those who are suffering the worst effects are, of course, the least responsible for it. And as I said before, climate justice necessarily includes all forms of justice, including very significantly reproductive justice, whose principles state, and I'm looking at the book here by Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger, that all children must be raised in self and healthy neighborhoods, and that there must be gender and sexual autonomy for all people. With that, we would have just sustainability for the planet if reproductive justice were a reality. Next. At the People's Climate March in 2014, the figure of Mother Earth was everywhere. The poster for the march by Fabiana Rodriguez, Defienda Nuestra Madre, and throughout the crowd. And I like to pay a little attention to this figure of Mother Earth next. Think Mother Earth is motivating particularly indigenous, but environmentalist movements worldwide. And most significantly, think of Berta Cáceres, the assassinated Honduran indigenous leader, who, when she accepted the Goldman Prize in 2015, almost a year before she was assassinated, for the work she was doing, she wrote, COPIN, the organization that she co-founded, defends the Lenca territory and our natural resources as part of our Lenca cosmovision of respect for Mother Earth. So, you can see here, Mother Earth is not some kind of trivial figure, as often appears in Western discourse, but this very profound central part of a cosmovision of respect. Okay, next. The international movement for Mother Earth rights that's making sure that mountains and rivers get legal rights akin to human rights, understands Mother Earth to be an indivisible living community of interrelated and interdependent beings with a common destiny. So that's a definition that we must keep in mind. Okay, next. Of course, catastrophic eco-violence proceeds from a very different kind of cosmovision, one of human domination over and disrespect for Mother Earth, as scripted in Western religion, philosophy, and science. If we look on the right, that's an ad for tampons in 2012 that shows Mother Earth happily, cut Mother Nature down to size, right? If Mother Nature were cut down to size, none of us would be alive. We are completely dependent upon the system that we understand as nature. We can see Rene Descartes and Francis Bacon were two of the architects of this cosmovision. We must make ourselves, Descartes said, masters and possessors of nature. Next slide, please. And, you know, it's also, of course, in religion. And Dr. Dolores Williams reminds us that historically, Christianity has mandated that man have dominion over nature, and that this played into many systemic oppressions, including how Christian slaveholders believed they had ownership over the so-called lower orders of nature, and they assigned Black men and women to the order of the subhuman. So some people in this domination of over nature, the elite group, you know, in Europe, decided that everybody else could be defined into nature, more or less, considered some human, considered part of nature and not really part of human or the masters and the dominators, but to be dominated. Okay, next. And Shamara Shantu Riley reminds us that we think of ecology, we were talking a bit before, that we're humanists and artists in this panel, and that you know, we're not really about policy in so much or economics, but, you know, it's really important, like what people believe, what are the systems of belief, and that, you know, there are these socio-political and very much religious and philosophical systems of fear and hatred, Riley says, of all that is natural, non-white, and female that has dominated Western thought for centuries. And this, you know, I study popular culture, and I'm picking up all the time, like images that show how prevalent this belief system still is. And it's embedded. Nobody has to sit you down and teach it. It's embedded in the kind of imagery that we see all the time and our language. All right, next. Just to remind us of like how much of this eco-crisis came about because of the kind of colonization and slaveholding ventures and land and genocide ventures of the same time of that, installation of this disrespect for Mother Earth. This is a conquistador image from the 16th century with the sword and the compass. We conquer, and mas, imas, 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 that kind of addictive greed for more and more. And America pictured as a naked woman to be conquered by the Europeans. Next, please. We still see this kind of image. And as Amanda Lickers and Lindsay Nixon remind us in their poster on the right, that this kind of idea of a land to be conquered, a supposedly empty land with subhuman people or just so-called nature on it, that this is actually a form of rape culture. This is an invasion without consent. It's stealing, it's taking, it's destroying integrity. So that ecocide is a form of rape culture. And, you know, in English, we all know that. We get this all the time. We nuke the bitches or drill that, or we have all sorts of understandings that this kind of domination is sexualized, it's racialized, and it's a masculinized domination and possession of nature. Okay, next. And, you know, just again, even in activism, you know, here's Fabiana Rodriguez again, respect for where you come from. Don't frack with me. Okay, next. Maggie Mal Pandera, who is the second woman to my right as I'm looking at this, she works with a group called Women, a Pan-African eco-feminist organization. And she expresses what so many of us who come to this work do, that we started out being activists against men's violence against women. And that the more you get involved in eco-activism, you find that communities that you're working with express that these violence are linked in a logics of extractivism, of violence, destruction, and domination. And it plays out on the land, and it also plays out on women's bodies, the bodies of youth, the bodies of LGBTQ people as well. So let's keep going. And this is a great resource, the book on the right, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies, Building an Indigenous Response to Environmental Violence, and really talks about the ways that all the kind of violences against the earth, and particularly associated with extractive industries, create the conditions of really heightened violence against women. And we see the March for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women that accompanies this kind of ecocide. Inevitably, let's keep going. It happens all over the world. And Leanne Bedamasake Simpson reminds us that this kind of extraction is which your land is seen as a resource, your body becomes a resource, and this kind of extractive industry, which can be taking place spiritually, psychologically, materially, physically, of bodies and of land, is stealing. It's a form of rape. It's taking without consent. And the same, you know, kind of extractive next please, was also, of course, characteristic of European and European American enslavement of African peoples. This is the great artist Nona Faustine, who poses in Wall Street on a box symbolizing a slave auction box, and says, and this is so, like, from her body sprang their greatest wealth, using Black women's bodies as a resource. So to create the kind of wealth that we now know as Wall Street. Okay, thanks, Danny. I'm at my time. So let me just see one last slide. I'll close with Dolores Williams, that the assault upon the natural environment today is but an extension of that assault upon Black women's bodies in the 19th century. So I think my point here today has been to really highlight that, like, if we think about ecocide and climate catastrophe, not only we need climate justice, and we really have to look at the sexual and gender domination that are at the root of it, and how much reproductive justice, including sexual and gender autonomy for all, is so crucial to solving that. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stefanie Dunning. We kind of decided on the order ahead of time, but without our amazing host, Janelle, to give structure, I thought I would just let you know that we are proceeding by plan. Yay, Janelle's here.
Janelle's here, yay.
So what I thought I would do is I don't have any PowerPoint slides for you, I'm sorry to say, but I thought what I would do is just read a little bit from my book, which is coming out in a few days. It's officially coming out, I think, on the 22nd. It's called Black to Nature, Pastoral Return in African American Culture. So I thought I would just read the first couple of pages, and there are a lot of things that Jane said in her talk that resonate with some of the stuff in the book that may or may not be apparent from these couple of pages, but that we can definitely get into in the Q&A. So I'm gonna just read a little bit from the introduction. It opens with a poem by Lucille Clifton, and the title of the poem is A Black and Living Thing. The earth is a living thing, is a black shambling bear, ruffling its wild back and tossing mountains into the sea. Is a black hawk circling, the burying ground circling the bones, picked clean and discarded. Is a fish black blind in the belly of water, is a diamond blind in the black belly of coal. Is a black and living thing, is a favorite child of the universe. Feel her rolling her hand in its kinky hair, feel her brushing it clean. Ruptures. It's July 2016, and I'm riding in my cousin's big Suburban in rural North Georgia. She's invited me to a resort where a coworker has gifted her a big multi-room suite. There isn't much to do at this resort if you don't play golf, except go to the swimming pool. The first day we go to the swimming pool, we're relieved that our family isn't the only Black family there. Our sheer numbers seem to diffuse the discomfort of the white swimmers. Almost. I try not to notice as white people slowly leave the pool when we enter. I manage to focus on my family, the sunshine, and the fresh, crisp smell of the southern spring air. On the second day, my cousin tells me there are some beautiful waterfalls nearby. It's a short hike from the trailhead to the waterfall, and we all set off. Me, my daughter, my cousin, and her mother, and her son, and 2 other cousins and their children. In all, we are 5 women with 5 children. We pull up directions on my phone's GPS app. It takes us deeper into the woods, into the country, until there is no longer a signal. We find ourselves creeping up a graveled road too narrow for 2 cars to pass side by side. There are few signs and no other travelers. My cousin gets nervous, and as we round a corner only to reveal more unending country gravel road, she stops the car and backs up. What are you doing, I ask. I'm a hiker, a backpacker, a regular camper. I was looking forward to this family hike. It's too deserted. I can't do this. I can't take the chance. The chance of what, I ask? Of bumping into the wrong white people out there. My cousin had a point. The woods and white people are the stuff of Black nightmares. The incident caused me to contemplate the relationship Black people have or don't to nature, especially because for most of my life, I've nurtured a deep love for the natural world. Neither my love for nature nor my cousin's legitimate fear of it is at odds with what is a long and deep ecological Black history. Lucille Clifton, in her poem, The Earth is a Living Thing, asserts that the earth is alive, a critical observation for the revelations of this volume. And she aligns the living earth with Blackness when she writes that the earth is a Black and living thing. Throughout the poem, Clifton aligns animals, plants, and being with Blackness, thereby naturalizing Black life relative to the earth environment. Like Clifton's poem, Black to Nature is doubly invested in thinking about the earth as alive and about Black people's relationship to it. But public perception leans heavily toward the notion that Black people and nature don't mix. There's a well-known Funny or Die skit called The Black Hiker. In it, the actor Blair Underwood is hiking in a pastoral setting. As he encounters whites on the trail, they act shocked to see him, and the skit gets funnier as the people he encounters become increasingly more open about their sense of surprise that a Black person is hiking, asking to take pictures with him and calling their friends over to witness the Black hiker. The idea that Black people do not enjoy nature is prevalent throughout our culture, not just in this skit. The narrative of the nature aversive Black person is echoed in headlines like "National parks reach out to Blacks who aren't visiting," and "Why people of color don't visit national parks." A simple Google search returns hundreds of articles that attempt to explain the absence of Black people from recreational nature sites and activities. Operating in tandem with this perception of nature in a recreational or even a rural sense as being white territory is the construction of Black people as urban subjects. It is not my intention to assert that it is untrue that many Black people live in cities and are averse to nature-centered activities. Rather, I propose that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many Black texts, and some centered on but not authored by Black characters, revisit the site of the agrarian, the rural, or the natural world, and this pastoral return can be read as a symbolic deployment of the argument for the abolition of civil society. And I'm going to say more about abolitionism in relation to environmentalism when we get to the Q&A. If it is true, as scholars such as Orlando Patterson, Jared Sexton, Frank Wilderson, and Sadia Hartman assert, that Black people, quote, embody a meta-aporia for humanist thought and action, which proceeds from slavery, end quote, then the abolition we have all been waiting for has yet to arrive. Explaining this perhaps startling insight, Frank B. Wilderson III writes, quote, "Blackness is coterminous with slaveness. Blackness is social death, which is to say that there was never a prior meta moment of plenitude, never a moment of equilibrium, never a moment of social life. Blackness as a paradigmatic position cannot be disimbricated from slavery," end quote. Abolition by this account is not simply mobilizing a rights discourse or changing a few laws. It is the complete dismantling and collapse of civilization as we know it. Calvin Warren speaks of this collapse as the end of the world. What is meant is not the end of the earth, but rather the end of civil society, which is the only way the Black person can ever be liberated from the afterlife of slavery. Importantly, for this volume, the collapse of civilization in the text I analyze here, or in any hierarchical social structure, is often imagined as a return to nature, since we have all been encouraged to view nature as anathema to forward progress and to believe that such progress equals freedom. The texts I analyze here contest the construction of nature as other and implicitly reject the notion that human evolution can be measured by the degree to which we are in control of the natural environment. In my focus on nature in the chapters that follow, I build on the Zen concept of interbeing, first articulated by Thich Nhat Hanh, to describe what I see as a distinct way that Black texts engage nature. And as I show below, both nature and Blackness are defined as outside of society, both as socially dead, and the unchecked freedom of either represents a subversion of the law and order of Western society. I'm going to move ahead a little bit. All right, in this introduction, I outline what I call ruptures from nature that explain and reveal what is at stake in Black claiming or disclaiming of nature. I discussed the following historical and epistemological factors. A, discourses of primitivism, B, forced agrarian labor, that is chattel slavery, and C, pastoral violence, that is lynching. These factors inform and structure Black nature discourses and reveal the at once problematic and productive possibilities of explorations and representations of nature in Black texts. And I want to pause here to acknowledge the fraught and overdetermined use of the word nature. Nature, wilderness, the rural, and the agrarian are all, quote, racially and culturally particular constructions with intellectual and aesthetic origins in romantic sublimity and American transcendentalism, end quote, according to Paul Oatkud's analysis. It will be evident enough as we proceed, if it isn't already, that the natural world as a construction and all that this implies and entails has been used as a symbol of both evil and goodness, but has no inherent moral or immoral quality. Yet the historical and epistemological meanings that cohere in the term nature mean to evoke it is to reference a complicated and violent history in relation to race. And I'm gonna pause there and just sort of extemporaneously say that one of the things I think that I would like to put on the table for us to discuss in the Q&A is that, from my view, in much the same way that my book is sort of framed through a kind of Afro-pessimistic theoretical lens. And I think people often misunderstand Afro-pessimism as saying that any kind of life is like not recuperable. But I don't read it that way. I actually read it as saying, within the context of this white supremacist patriarchal regime, we can't see the end of anti-Blackness because it requires anti-Blackness to exist. So the call for abolition is where the optimism of Afro-pessimism lives. It's on the other side of that line of abolition. And I would also make a similar kind of argument relative to how we might think about environmental problems, because as Jane pointed out, the environmental degradation, which has been the result of the European diaspora, is deeply imbricated in violations of African and indigenous people. And so I don't think it's possible to imagine a different environmental future unless we also think about abolition. So in the same way that abolition of this regime is required to free Black people and all other people, it's also required to save the environment. So we can talk more about that, but I think I have hit my time now. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Praba. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so many different threads that I'm so excited to dialogue on. I wanted to share a PowerPoint, and so I'm just gonna go right there right now. And I really want to thank Dr. Janelle Hobson for inviting me. I really want to thank Stefanie and Jane for being on this panel. And I really want to thank those of you who have joined us on Zoom. I am speaking from the unceded territories of the Chochenyu and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, and from the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. This is also known as Oakland, California. I've been creating projects critical of the negative impacts of emerging technologies since 1998. This work has been informed by cyber feminists and theorists that include Donna Haraway, Alondra Nelson, Anna Everett, Kim Tallbear, and Gloria Ansaldúa, Angela Davis and Herbert Marcuse, David Noble, Lisa Nakamura, and Saskia Sassen, and a multitude of other artists and writers. For the last few decades, cyber feminists of color have produced immense amounts of work critical of the negative environmental, cultural, and sociological impacts of the internet, web and social media, of surveillance, of racialized algorithms and racialized technological violence, of artificial intelligence and militarized uses of emerging technologies, of toxic materials, work conditions, and waste generated by electronics and computer manufacturing, and of displacement and dispossession in the key localities most impacted by tech, where there's the mining that's going on or the dumping that's going on. With the release of the new popular film, The Social Dilemma, which enacted a tactical erasure of decades of rigorous critique, it seems others are now willing to join this urgent dialogue. My solo and collaborative environmental projects have touched on trafficking of women over the internet, militarization, and surveillance. On the right, there I am as the Messiah or the Reverend, talking about the salvation narratives embedded in tech and the cult-like discourses and behaviors of that sector. I've talked about digital divide delusions, the libertarian ideologies, and the abuse of power of this sector, and the false narratives of recycling and the destructive dumping of e-waste. Over the last decade, my work has shifted from analyzing the extractocene, so with Jane's talk about extraction, I consider this the geological age of extraction industries and logics and the mindset introduced globally by Europe through the colonization of our hemisphere and other regions. I've shifted to working directly as an artist on expanding agency, conviviality, and communal experiences that generate agency, the sense of agency in publics. I focused on the work of the historian of agency, Achille Mbembe, on Dr. Alex Wilson's decolonizing practices and webs of relations, and on the Zapatistas' emancipatory processes. In a separate but related project with Anuj Vaidya, Larval Rock Stars, we look at pluriversal pedagogies, and I really want to share how I see the pluriversal. In his interviews with Gloria Muñoz Ramirez, Subcomandante Marcos described how the urban guerrillas of the FLN had to escape into the mountains of Chiapas in the 1980s. They then lived in indigenous communities, and their ideas of Marxist revolution and social change and liberation that they arrived with were completely challenged by the communities. And through long interactions, those very ideas were defeated. Marcos shares, quote, as a product of that defeat, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional started to grow exponentially and become very otherly, close quote. That's from the interview with Gloria Muñoz Ramirez. This encounter of different worlds and the defeat of the Marxist guerrillas' ideological positions derived from elsewhere created a radical rupture with past methods of revolutionary action. In this sense, I am seeking my own ideological defeat and becoming very otherly to create the conditions for encounters with radical difference as a model of reimagining what I and we think about technology and about our abilities to create other worlds astride what we're living through right now, which I consider the necro-techno complex. As an artist and as a mestiza muisca colombiana, I've been working with corn since 1995. In 2018, I began developing a socially engaged public project focused on hemispheric technologies of maíz or corn and on the indigenous technology of nixtamalización, nixtamalization. This project, the Tecnotamaladas, asks publics to reimagine and strengthen present-day resurgence and survival in communities of color by sharing present-day and ancestral knowledge of technologies of life from the Indigenous Americas and African American communities. We move from silicon chips to maíz, to nixtamalización, to tamaladas. I recruit Indigenous, African American, Afro-Latino, Latinx, immigrant communities, hackers, programmers, tech workers, political leaders, sustainable tech groups, and many others to sit together and make and share hundreds of tamales while transferring knowledge of technologies of survival and resurgence. In 2021, I invited Mexican scholar and activist Charlotte Sáenz, who works on Pedagogía de la Semilla, pedagogy of the seed, in southern Mexico, and Ben Simmons, who is an African American artist and long-term AIDS survivor, to work with me on this project. The tamaladas are oriented along generosity and dialogue. The project brings together different collective processes as technologies of life. Here are images from the 2019 tamaladas at a food bank on the Oakland-Emeryville border, where over 1,000 folks dialogued at 3 tamaladas. At one, we made Mesoamerican tamales. At another one, we made Colombian tamales. At another one, we made African American tamales. And as you can see in some of the images, on the top row, the second image is the mayor of Emeryville and city council member making tamales and sharing tamales with folks whose lives are at risk that come to the food bank. So we discussed increasing poverty, displacement, homelessness, the extreme wealth inequality that the Silicon Valley tech industry has brought to our region. And we shared knowledge of resistance and resurgence over delicious, collectively made tamales. With COVID-19 conditions, I shifted the project online and over 2020 did an extensive online tour of the project, grew a community milpa locally with partners, and gave the fresh organic corn away to a disabled housing community, hosted a webinar on the milpa with Ben and Charlotte, and much more. In April of 2021, I was awarded a Cultura Power Fellowship for the project. And I'm bringing this up because it's a Cultura Power. And it was awarded by MACLA, the Movimiento de Arte y Cultura Latinoamericana, that is in San Jose, California, which is really the base of Silicon Valley. So over the 6 months of this fellowship, which began this month, this fellowship that recognizes, supports, and sustains the power of culture. I will be doing COVID-safe outdoor walks and talks with community members to continue dialoguing on these issues, while also doing online events sharing knowledge from Peru, Oaxaca, Oakland, Mississippi, and other regions of Abya Yala. Our local issues with Silicon Valley are regional issues, national issues, international issues. They go far beyond nation-state borders. As environmental defenders like Berta Cáceres are being murdered across the world, particularly in Colombia and Mexico, Ecuador, Central America, I continue to work alongside these much larger social movements on planetary engagement, on justice, and on resurgence. And if you like any updates or information about this project, it's at that website. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm so glad that you all were able to keep it moving without skipping a beat. I'm also grateful that I'm only like a few minutes away from campus. So I did just, while I was signing in, I finally got a ping from my phone and I was nicely alerted that my power is not coming back on until 6 o'clock. So, you know, power issues, and it's widespread, so it's not just me. So fortunately it did not reach our campus. So, but yes, thank you so much, and thank you all who are attending this virtual panel. And I also especially want to thank all of my speakers for, one, being able to keep this going. Thank goodness I made you all co-hosts. Before, you know, I lost power, and also just to really bring all of your amazing, insightful research into this discussion. So I did want to let everyone know that I have some prepared questions for the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to a general Q&A with our attendees. So you have some options in terms of how you can raise your questions. You can either post to our Q&A, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask any of our speakers any of your questions, or even if you just have comments. So so let's go with the few questions. I only have like 3 prepared questions I have for the panel before we open up to the general discussion. And my first question, thinking through all of the different points that you've raised, you know, with everything that we know about our current climate crisis, and with even our COVID pandemic seemingly linked to our environmental crisis, humanity and all of their life are at a crossroads. So what do you believe needs to immediately take place in order to move forward in a sustainable way and for a feminist future? And I would love it if you can also tie it to some of the issues you raised in your own presentation. Any of you can start off.
Well, I'll try.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, I read the questions to my partner, who is a scientist, and he said, well, if it's immediate, it can't have mass and momentum. He said it has to be cyclical. I mean, that's probably beyond. And I think, you know, I want to stop thinking about, I guess I want us to, if something could immediately happen, if suddenly we could all hear the voice of the earth. I think the earth is, and all of being is speaking to us. And I think even some of the technologies and the hatreds, everything we've been talking about, are all also designed to mute that voice, right? And to make the overwhelming ego, including like as a president or something, be all we can hear, you know? So I guess I would say immediately, if like there could be a sudden magic moment where we would all really hear, and I think a lot of us do hear this, but if everyone could hear it, that would be nice. But that's just sort of wishful.
Okay. We can think more about what it means to listen to the earth too.
Yeah.
Even that, I'm not sure everybody is on the same page.
I think there's a small clue in what happened during the COVID shutdown. So you know, it wasn't, I mean, it was sort of, I think, overblown on social media, some of the ecosystem bounce back stuff, but there was certainly like some ecosystem bounce back stuff just from the cessation of like human activity. And I think that like we have a tendency to, and to me, this is like really tied up in like Western notions of like agency and like the self and identity, where it's always this idea that I have to like actually go out and do something. I have to create a big political platform And a lot of times I think what we really need to do is to stop. Like what we need is a cessation of human activity. We need less driving. We need less buying. We need people to like stop just where you are. And I think that ties into what Jane was saying about listening, right? Because it's hard to listen when you're in the sort of hustle and bustle of everything. I actually wrote a whole other paper for this, and then I was like, oh, I probably shouldn't read that. But the paper begins with me sort of talking about a conundrum I had 15 years ago when my daughter was born. Right before she was born, like a month before she was born, I was trying to figure out, like, should I use disposable diapers or should I use cloth diapers? And as I began to research it, what I discovered was it really, you know, the best decision for the earth really depends on where you live. If you live in California, then disposables are the way to go because of water shortages. You don't want to be doing 2 loads of laundry a day cleaning these diapers. But if you live in Ohio, where I live, where there's a lot of water, then cloth diapers are the best way to go. But the bottom line is, like, lots of poop is just bad for the environment. Like every time you flush the toilet, it's just not good for the environment. So no matter, I mean, so we're in, because of the system we live in, we're in a really particular situation where there isn't really an easy answer. It's not like we can all just drive Teslas and then it'll be solved, because of course, you know, batteries require mining, and that mining is done with child labor. And I mean, even our ability to sort of have this conversation is mediated through the problem, right? The problem of these computers that are doing horrible harm to the environment, right? But we need to have these conversations. So we're actually really caught in a patchwork of entanglements that make the question of how to proceed an incredibly complex kind of question. And so the only thing that I have been able to see is, like, during COVID, everybody was kind of forced to stop and just kind of stay at home. And that seemed to have some positive impact on the environment. But the problem with that isn't, probably most of us would be happy to continue to stay home 3 out of 5 days a week if we had to, right? We'd be happy with that, most of us. But capitalism would not be happy with that. And so, so we have this sort of like countervening force against, like, what is the most obvious and easiest thing we could all do, which is like cut down all of our activity and all of our consumption by 40% or 50%. If we could all do that globally, it would be great. But the economies would collapse, right? Because they're predicated on capitalism functioning in a certain kind of way. And so, so just like my diaper conundrum, we find ourselves in a tough position. And this, you know, this contributes to my sense of like eco-pessimism, because, you know, in the same way that I think, you know, just sort of having a few laws around the police is not going to keep them from killing, you know, Black people and Indigenous people at record rates. Like, as long as the state is in place, as long as we have property, we're going to have police, and they're going to kill people who are defined as the enemies of property. As long as we have this civilization, we're going to destroy the environment. And so, you know, so anything that slows civilization down helps the environment. Anything that accelerates civilization hurts the environment. And so we're kind of in a fix, I guess, is what I'm saying. So there is an answer there, but the answer is an answer most people really don't want to hear. Most people just want to think that if they drive an electric car and recycle and buy some eggs from down the street, it's all good. But really the problem's much more intractable than that.
Thank you for saying that. I definitely want to call on Praba because of the work she does around technologies and recuperating, you know, earlier indigenous civilizations, because I'm always struck, I don't know if it's, you know, true with everyone else, but I'm always struck that we have this idea that we didn't have any other civilization until Western civilization. And yet we've had previous civilizations. And not only did we have other civilizations, but they didn't destroy the earth. And so I wonder about how do we recuperate that knowledge? And I'm thinking specifically bringing Praba, you know, into the conversation about when you talk about technologies and how it has, you know, accelerated a lot of the crises. I'm wondering what you're thinking of in terms of how do we envision something else?
Thank you. Yeah, and picking up on the other two talks and the pointing at the extraction, also the need for abolition as a fundament of going forward. I focused on technology in the late 90s because I'm an environmentalist, because I'm from the land. I'm part of Earth. Yo soy de este planeta. And I noticed that my environmental issues were spraying pesticides on farm workers, spraying paraquat for 15 years in Colombia that ruined all our land. All of the ways that the state and the corporations they represent and the multinationals they represent are able to do incredible levels of toxicity freely. And so I really focused on the technology sector because people weren't aware of how much that industry and that sector generates toxicity, pollution, extreme damage, and all of these false notions were being introduced that there's a technological fix. All new, as you're saying, Stefanie, all new accelerations cause more problems, more toxicity, more CO2, and it's CO2, it's colonialism, right? So I've really, my push right now is as someone that is involved in environmental organizations like Women's Eco Artist Dialogue and in other arenas I can be in, I'm working really hard on addressing racism inside the environmental movement. Some of the racist actions of Extinction Rebellion recently, some of the ways that organizers of climate change marches push Indigenous and Black people to the back, and they want to replace them with happy costuming and animals. And you're like, it's a clear message going on here. I had to join a greening a campaign with the political ecology group against the greening of hate. That's where we need really severe, serious kind of looking at intersectionality right there in the environmental movement. So I've been publishing on this and working with Alex Wilson. We published a chapter in a book. The book was Why Don't the Poor Fight Back? And we're like, you're just not going to see 500 years of fighting and resistance in our hemisphere. There's so much fighting back going on by Indigenous people and Afro descendants, especially I'm from Colombia. We have palenques. We have a particular history of resistance of Afro Colombianos and Afro descendants in Colombia, the currently known region, Colombia. And so for me, I'm really want to see accountability and change, drastic change in the environmental movement. And there's so many resources on green diversity that have been put out by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And there's so many obvious signs of this, including the way that the Inuit filmmaker made The Angry Inuk to show how Greenpeace hurt the Inuk community and caused thousands of deaths. And so on the one side, I really want to push the environmental movement to address and be accountable and change now, immediately, as fast as possible. And really, I appreciate, Stefanie, what you're bringing up with the abolition. It's one person I hung out with back when the Afro Geeks conferences were happening with Anna Everett and this amazing community that was meeting in Santa Barbara and the UCs, Art McGee. And Art McGee always said, there's no conflict between Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. And I really appreciate how you described Afro-pessimism. And so like in the technological space, we have opportunities to reclaim that word, to reclaim that concept. And I'm working with publics on reclaiming the word itself back from Silicon Valley, back from Monsanto and Novartis and Bayer, back from the US military and, and their exoskeletons, back from Harvard and MIT making so much military technology, and so UC Berkeley, back. No, that's not your word, that's not your concept. Thousands and thousands of years of technology has happened on this planet, before 1,000 years ago, and we can really look at these technologies of life, but we can't be individuals. We can't be egocentric. We have to be ecocentric, and we have to do it collectively, and we have to listen. And the tamales, in a way, is a listening project, because it takes 6 hours to make tamales, and you have to be together even if you don't like each other. And not many people really like the political leaders, but they were there. They were there and listening. And so it's like, I want to see the environmental movement be accountable, and I'm experimenting with how to reclaim that word and say, our knowledge is our resurgence. Where we come from, you cannot move forward without looking behind, because there's no future or past.
Yeah.
And so our resurgence is what I'm interested in.
All right, I love that. There's no past, no future. It's all interconnected. My next question is about interconnectedness, actually, because I'm specifically thinking of intersectional analysis, right? Because I'm thinking of how white supremacy, settler colonialism, neoliberal capitalism, misogyny, and environmental devastation are all intrinsically connected. So how do reverse ideologies like anti-racism, anti-imperialism, feminism, and environmental consciousness, how do those ideologies intersect so that it provides us with a blueprint for the future? Any of you can answer? Or maybe I'll start with Stefanie.
You can feel my confusion. Well, I do think that anti-racism and the defeat of patriarchy and trans and homophobia and classism are tied to saving the environment. But I think that there is, by that I mean, I don't think that one can happen without the other. So I don't think it's possible to change our relationship to the environment as a culture without changing our relationship to each other in these fundamental ways. And so, I just watched Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, for example. And, I just kept thinking, there was so many images throughout the documentary series. And, in addition to all of these sort of broken and brutalized human bodies, it's in this landscape, right? It's in this landscape that's also being brutalized. We have this belief, or it's something that Praba said that I talk about a lot in my work. There's a belief in Western culture that nature is an other, that it's outside of you. And in fact, it's not true at all, right? Like the earth is like a tree, and we are the fruit of that tree. We are derivative of the earth. The earth is not a derivative of us. And so this perception that exists in the culture that somehow nature is a thing, like even when we construct the sentence of saving the environment, even that sentence sort of constructs nature as other than us. And really, the problem that we face is a big one, because the question is, can we save ourselves? If we couldn't save ourselves, if we can, I don't think we can undo, but if we can get through and come out on the other side of what has been wrought by the European diaspora, then I think there all the answers lie for how we can reestablish harmony with the environment that many of our ancestors had established and that was destroyed in the onslaught of the European diaspora. For me, those things are very, very deeply tied together. The sort of the defeat of patriarchy, the defeat of racism is like very much the same project as, you know, safeguarding the environment. So.
Okay. Jane, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the essence of climate justice, even in like all those slogans I showed at the beginning, right? That these things all, and I would just reiterate that I think climate justice is reproductive justice, that, you know, the principles of reproductive justice are so profound, really. Not only women have the right to terminate a pregnancy, that women have the right to have the pregnancy that they want in safe and healthy conditions, but all children must have safe and healthy environments. Okay, right? That's it, right? The entire planet must be safe and healthy. And that gender and sexual autonomy for all people, because as much as, you know, central to all these abolitions is also the abolition of rape, right? And which is a possession, a taking, an extraction, and then a dumping, right? So Andrea Dworkin once asked us to imagine a world without rape, and said it's so many people find that impossible. You know, we have to believe, and it is possible. There have been worlds without rape, right? The lie is that. So yeah.
All right, thank you. I have one more question that I'm going to ask everyone before I open up to the general audience. And that is, I want us to think about a specific date. I've heard the year 2028 that was put out there in terms of the Green New Deal. And with that in mind, I'd like you to think about, you know, what would you most like to see happen that year that most benefits the environment and humanity's relationship to the environment? So, vision time, what are you hoping? What would you like to see?
You know, since you mentioned the Green New Deal, there's an essay by the writer of the Green New Deal, Rihanna Gunn Wright, where she talks about that she's very interested in writing policy, but the most important thing of policy is a vision. I'm trying to find it right now, but I just thought I'd bring her into this. No, I can't find it, of course. But the Green New Deal emerges from an analysis of the climate crisis that identifies it as, I'm quoting her, as a consequence of systems, neoliberalism, strategic racism, unfettered capitalism, and their interaction. You know, that, so she is, of course, that is absolutely everything we're talking about today is implicit in the Green New Deal. And she says, it really is important. We have to present, she says, a clear narrative about what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how, well, she's saying the government, but I think all of us, just what we're doing here today, and how we can, you know, envision a different world. So right there from her, anyway. So homage to Rihanna Gunn Wright for doing that work.
Yes, and for bringing her name in. Thank you for that. Okay, the other panelists, do you want to weigh in?
I think about the present in a strange kind of way as capitalist theater. And culture matters, and it's capitalist theater. And right behind that curtain, and the most important, one of the most important parts of capitalist theater is that we are disengaged from the planet. We're not part of this planet. We're somehow not part of this planet as human species. So when you pull back the curtain, you just see this thing. Greed is killing us. Greed is killing us. There's no right behind that curtain. Okay, greed is killing us. So I'm excited about social movements. I'm excited about. I want to see more political engagement, more showing up and saying, "All right, you messed it up. You know, you never made space for me, but I'm going to show up and put myself in here again." And I've been trying to do that, and others have been trying to. It's very difficult work, working with difference and folks who really want to shut you out. But I saw so much political movement sparked by the white supremacist outing party that's been the last really serious the last 4 years. That more people got involved in politics, And so I think it's really helpful if by then there's so much engagement that we can actually really come out with a serious Green New Deal and really take it seriously.
Stephanie?
I wrote a whole list, but I won't read it to you. And I sent it to my best friend, and she was like, none of that's ever gonna happen. I mean, I think by 2028, wow, that's like right around the corner. I would like to see some of the things we've learned from the COVID lockdown remain in place, right? Like, I mean, there are lots of funny memes like that came out where it would be like a picture of someone and the little, cartoon underneath would say, little thing underneath would say, I knew this meeting could have been online all these years, like, because then that's cutting down on the driving, the commuting that people are doing. It's cutting down on the use of electricity in the buildings at institutions, at workplaces and things like that. So I think it would be great if we could take some of what we learned about the cessation of human activity during the pandemic, which was that was like, as horrible as the pandemic was, there was information we got about the environment and our activity. It would be really great if we could actually codify that and find a way to make some of it policy as opposed to just being like kind of accidental. So that would be really great. Like, but again, capitalism is over there going, don't say that. But it would be really great if it was like, okay, instead of kids going to school 5 days a week, they went 3 days a week. Or probably every parent is also like, don't say that. But still, like all of these different ways in which we could take how the cessation of this activity help the environment and then actually make some of that official. It would be great if we could institute a moratorium on all single-use containers of every kind, not just like water bottles, but plastic bags, the stuff in the grocery store, milk cartons, just all the voluminous packaging that exists when we buy things, so that every store would look like that section in Whole Foods where you have to just bring your own thing and you have to reuse it. So just a phased out moratorium on single-use, items, and, a true crackdown on fast fashion. So, because that's another huge area of waste production, and the wide-scale institution of compost toilets. So, that's my fantasy wish list for 2028. I have like 17 more items, but we'll just start with that.
All right, thank you. So at this point, I would like to invite our attendees to raise their questions to our panel. We actually have one in the Q&A. You could either post in the Q&A or raise your hand and I'll unmute you so that you can ask it out loud. So the first question in the Q&A is from Allison Botkin. I am so impressed by each of the presenters, and one theme that stood out was how environmental justice has many factions of the greening of hate. How do you discuss this with environmental history, conservation specifically, and the problematic figures of historically anti-immigration, white supremacist, and racist views like John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, Dave Foreman, and John Canton? So anyone wants to respond to that?
I'm happy to jump in there. This is one of the reasons why in my work I try to articulate another kind of language for environmental engagement, because in the United States, a lot of those traditional environmentalists, and also just even state parks, like, people don't realize that Yellowstone is formed to keep the Sioux from hunting there. Like, Yellowstone is opened with the US Army, right? I mean, it's so even when you're like sort of going to Yellowstone and you're feeling your nature high or whatnot, the history of how these spaces get carved out and constructed in the country is just highly problematic. And so So I think there has to be, and I think I see this in all of our work, you know, it's a complicated move, but there has to be a kind of disidentification with those problematic aspects of environmentalism and eco-criticism that have been so racist and so much about settler, colonists sort of occupying the land, you know, really in cancerous ways. And so I think those distinctions have to be made. Like we have to author a new vocabulary for thinking about Black and brown and feminist engagement with these questions, and think about the ways in which people's work is departing from those traditions.
Mm-hmm. And this might just be obvious, but of course, you know, put those historical figures right up against like the killer in El Paso, Texas, and the kind of rhetoric they used about filth and contamination of people coming over the border, et cetera. So to show that this is, you know, really right now, or also, of course, Trump's rhetoric.
I just want to address that excellent question, and I think that it's very challenging to, and I think that, you know, with what Stefanie's saying of inventing a whole new framework and a language, and where you recognize this is a settler project, it's not an environmental project, it's a settler project. And I think that one of the complicated discussions I had with an Indigenous leader in of the Cree community in northern Manitoba was that if I don't want to be in those spaces, then there's an absence, and I have to be in those spaces. So I'm in those spaces because I am therefore murdered, the numerous daily murdered environmental land defenders in South America and Mexico and Central America. It's brutal and daily, the murder of environmental defenders. So there's a huge responsibility that I have to continue engaging. And I engage through I Don't Know More, like revolutionary movements that are Indigenous led, like I Don't Know More, and you know, Black Lives Matter, and movements that are looking at all these different aspects. And for me, they're all environmental justice movements. Because doing social and racial justice is doing environmental work.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Dina, a student of mine. How do we begin to shift from green capitalism as a solution to environmental degradation abuse to a framework of abolition and dismantling the US military, as it is the biggest polluter in the world aside from major corporations? Thank you for that question, Dina. All right, y'all are nodding and thinking that through.
well, you know, one of the things on my list was no more wars. Mm-hmm. No more drone strikes, no more bombs, mm-hmm. No more grenades, no more bullets, which have lead and they fall on the ground and then it leaches into the ground. And of course, you know, as people, you know, as I said, I mean, we are nature. It's not, I mean, when you kill someone, it is an environmental issue, as Praba points out, like, you know, and when you save someone, it's an environmental issue. How do we begin to dismantle, you know, green capitalism and actually move towards abolition? Well, I don't know. You know, like, and I think, you know, there's a quote from, you know, Frank Wilderson where he says, what it would take, you know, for the revolution to happen is a violence that's so catastrophic, no one wants it. Not even the most radical revolutionary wants that level of violence. But, you know, I suggest that it's possible, you know, that some changes could happen through atrophy. And you know, I just return again to this notion of cessation, to just the cessation of doing a bunch of stuff. And I often, I mean, as a meditator and like a super Zen person, I often think of how many horrific things could have been avoided if the person was just lazy. You know, like if the person was just like, well, I want to do this horrible thing, but I just can't get myself out of the house today, so it's going to be another Netflix marathon. Like, how much could be avoided if only people would embrace some kind of generative apathy. So I don't know. I don't know how that abolition happens, because when you kind of pull on one thread, something else goes. You know, I don't think we kind of ended up with this system, you know, completely out of like malevolent intent. I think some of this arose because people couldn't recognize the broader consequences of their actions. So there's like a Zen koan, which is like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? You know, of course, the sound of one hand clapping is no sound. And I think the point of the koan is that there is no such thing as a single, there's no action that's an island. Everything is relational. So whenever you undertake an action, you know, whatever it is, you can't just think, oh, well, if I throw out these wind turbines, it'll generate some green energy, so everything will be okay, without thinking about what the other side of that might be, what the other consequences might be. Because it's not just, that thing doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a kind of relational matrix. And that's the problem, is that in Western society, we're always trying to clap with one hand. We're like, oh, okay, well, we don't want to use fossil fuels. We don't want to use oil. So we'll just do this. We'll do electric, without understanding that that's in its whole system of production that has an environmental impact as well. And so we're kind of just moving things around. And so I think it requires a level of critical thinking and carefulness that you can kind of only get from the kind of work we do. And I'm not just saying that from an egotistical place. I'm saying the kind of work we do is about this like capacious complication of relations, right? Of thinking about, well, if we do this, then what is it going to do over here? And how can we begin to negotiate and kind of harmonize all these pieces? And I don't see that on the official level in our culture. And so I don't know how we get there, but I hope that conversations like these, if they can kind of ripple out through time and space, can start to, great minds can get together and figure it out together, collectively, not you know, with the will of one group or one person.
All right. Or thank you, Stefanie. I do want to call everyone's attention to Kit Bacon-Gresset, who shared a link to Rihanna Gunn Right's op-ed in the New York Times. So make sure you all get a chance to check that out. Also, there's another question, a colleague of mine, Barbara Sutton. In the context of the pandemic, there's sometimes the illusion that some activities that impact the environment have stopped, or perhaps they're just happening elsewhere. There is a tension between what institutions like corporations, state institutions may see as a cessation of activity that impacts the environment and that might save money to said institution, and the transference of the cost of those activities to individuals. For example, activity is not stopping, but now being subsidized by workers. So how can we address that? Thank you for that question, Barbara.
I want to know if your colleague knows the answer to that, because that sounds like a kind of policy, you know, planning kind of question. So I would like to know the answer to that one.
Well, I could, Barbara, if you are willing to.
Hi there.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it is an actual question, because this is something, you know, that I'm grappling with, you know, in terms of seeing, you know, how some some costs had been transferred to individual homes, right? Like that people, you know, have to provide, you know, supplies for work, or use their electricity, or use their, you know, heating systems at their homes. You know, you know, all these things, utility bills, all these things that perhaps when you go to a workplace are covered, you know, by the institution, by, you know, the corporation or whatever it is. In the context of the pandemic, it's our individuals who are bearing, those costs. I realize that, in terms of environmental impact is different, perhaps, just the cost of running a huge building and what happens in individual homes. But I just, was thinking, well, some things, kind of as with other stuff, like whether it's care work or, continue, but it's just are kind of outsourced. So it seems that are not happening, but it's just happening elsewhere. So that's kind of where my thinking was.
Right. Or like all the mothers who are having to teach and do all the childcare now that schools are closed.
Exactly.
Right. And the domestic violence rates going up because, the men are home all the time, or, and again, so that is a really good point. And that's certainly something that we see not just in the pandemic, but that's one of the major consequences of climate change, including in disasters, that the frontline communities of women, of femmes, of LGBTQ people, disabled people, poor people, racially stigmatized people, all suffer. So I think you bring up a really good point, that, and the pandemic is reiterating that. And so we have to really keep that. Again, I don't think practically as much as I would like to.
I can say that one of the places I work, one of the places I work, the union is really working very hard on addressing how there's been a transference of labor and an increase of labor with no, without any help with the additional costs. And it just so happens that particular space that I work has a strong union. And so people have committed to being active in the union, working in the union, shaping the union how they want the union to work, and then advocating for themselves. And so I am seeing in one of the many places I work that's working. It is being addressed. And in other spaces that I've been in, people are trying to address the disparity in who's considered an essential worker. That's not a frontline worker, but an essential worker, and what communities that's impacting. So where I live, Latinx communities that, they've been so hard hit with COVID, and African American communities have been so hard hit with COVID. And so the communities that can't stop working outside the home. And so addressing that with financial relief so that that people don't have to go to work. The municipality I live in, the city I live in, has paid people's rent during COVID 3 times if the person makes under $80,000 a year. Direct rent payments to landlords. They do not want to see people become homeless. So at 3 or 4 times, anyone who's made under 80,000, their rent is paid directly to the landlord. That's what needs to happen too, to have the municipalities take that money and use it to prevent further dispossession and displacement.
I'll just hop in there real quick and say that, all of the ways in which capitalism can be weakened improve the environment. So like with the kids, if we were at home more and the kids are at home more, without this like strange progress narrative that we have thrust upon ourselves and young people, where it's like kindergarten, elementary school, high school, college, job, house, debt, if we got rid of that whole narrative, then who gives a crap? The kids are at home, you do what you got to do, they're outside playing, they're doing whatever, they're having a kid life. And it's like, at some point they're going to figure out how to read and write and do math, but it may not be on a common core time frame. It might be the case that it doesn't happen in the linear way that we think it happens. But at the meantime, they might get a bunch of other really essential skills in their ability to play and be themselves and be outside if there's outside space, and in their ability to relate to each other without having to constantly operate within this like grade system. So, you know, that would remove a tremendous amount of pressure from parents at home who are thinking, if I don't impose this curriculum on my children, which they hate and the parents hate, well, they won't be able to go to college. And then they could, you know, end up being sort of disenfranchised when they're older because they won't be able to get a good job and all this other kind of stuff. Those kinds of pressures, if they were gone, right, would radically change our relationship, you know, to everything, to each other, and also to the environment. So in terms of that, the labor that was being done in one place that now gets done somewhere else, we can kind of ask ourselves, like, we could ask the question, like, does it actually need to happen this way? Like, do the children need to grow up this way? Like, you know, I mean, my daughter went to a Waldorf school where they don't even teach you how to read until the 4th grade, because it's just a completely different philosophy of brain development. And she's an excellent reader now. She's in the 9th grade and she's reading on the 12th grade level because she likes to read, because it wasn't like a torture when she was 5. But I mean, so we might be able to ask ourselves some questions about the way labor is shaped too, because all of our labor is in the shadow of slavery. Like even the workday, like the sun up to sundown workday, like where does that come from? Why do we need the workday to be like that? So I think we could begin to ask ourselves some really organic questions and reorder society. But again, capitalism won't be mad at these suggestions that Praba and I are making and Jane's making.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm actually thinking you brought that up about labor and leisure, because, you know, we're made to feel guilty if you have any, especially as a woman of color, Black women specifically, mule of the world. There's this idea that we're supposed to be constantly producing, constantly working, and this is why we have all of this overproduction of so many things that's not helpful for the environment. It's also reminding me of Ralph Hecht's Exterminate All the Brutes. It was in one of the episodes, he reminds us that, you know, first it was take over Native American land, then destroy the land because of cotton production. So the cotton was not only oppressing enslaved Black people, it was also oppressing the land. So there's so many things that we can do differently in terms of, or even to recognize the kind of resistance that our ancestors practiced, like slowing down, you know, when they would call enslaved people lazy, you know, let's think of laziness as a certain kind of resistance, but that's not how we see it. We see it as, you know, a disparaging term, and therefore, if you're not producing, then somehow, you know, you're worth less. I think even that concept of worthiness and whatnot, I think is also tied. So I really appreciate the conversations you are bringing up, because it's asking us to rethink a lot of other things: work, labor, you know, histories of oppression, slavery, border control, militarization, what have you. And so it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience, but I do welcome each of you. If you have any final thoughts before we wrap up, that would be great. Any final thoughts?
I would like to share a final thought. I'm in this world in time traveling at all times in states of wonder. I have absolutely no hope whatsoever. I don't use hope as a framework. Hope includes some kind of futurity. I just live in wonder at the brave and amazing things people do. And I also operate through very temporary utopias. They could be just an hour, a utopia of an hour where people are able to be outside of that capitalist system and outside of that greed-based and outside of all that stuff. And it fills me with wonder. And so that's here now. That's here now. And it's always around. And I try to help people recognize that it's here, right now. Not everything, just there is some. That's what I wanted to leave as my closing thoughts. Thank you. Okay. And I really want to thank the panelists. I've really great stuff to think about and feel and go through. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah.
All right.
I love that idea of temporary utopias. Yeah. I love that so much. And I was feeling a very similar kind of thing as my closing thought, which is like how generative and like nourishing this conversation has been. So, I mean, I'm a very pragmatic person, and you know, I lean, you know, pessimistically, nihilistically, in relation to the structures of this society. But you know, it's these kinds of connections and moments that show us what is possible if we keep looking for ways to expand these temporary utopias, right? It's not about making something come into existence because it exists. It's about expanding the borders, expanding the parameters of that temporary utopia, a term I totally love.
Me too.
Thank you for that, Praba.
Oh yeah, that is great.
Absolutely.
You know, we've just been in one, right?
Yeah.
We really have, because we're all going to be, you know, according to Interbeing, right? I mean, we are all now so much more aware of how much we are a part of each other. We can call on the energy and the knowledge that we've generated here. So I will, you know, that's a gift. So thank you, Janelle, for gathering us, right? So that
Thank you, Janelle.
Yes, thank you, Janelle.
That we are all
Mhm.
really in this together. Not a fake
Absolutely,
kind of.
absolutely. And even thank you for starting the conversation. That's the first part. and keeping us on track. I appreciate it. And thank you for accepting my invitation to do this. I think it all went wonderful. So I see a few comments in the chat. Make sure you read them. Yeah, many people are thanking you too. So this has been great. So I am wrapping up. It's 4:30. So I know that there are many other things we need to get done today.
Why don't we put our emails in the chat if anybody wants, because somebody was asking me about a PowerPoint or something. So.
Oh, yes. Yes, certainly share your emails if people are asking.
Whoops, I gave it to you. Sorry, everybody. Sorry, I interrupted. Janelle.
Oh,
I
okay.
just didn't want you to close before.
Okay, go ahead. All right, so thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel, and you know, happy Earth Week, not just Earth Day. And I really appreciate you. And yes, someone asked if this is recorded. Yes, it is recording, and I will be sharing the video on YouTube, so be on the lookout for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Thanks,
by the
everybody.
way, I do have a podcast if you're interested. It's called Black to Nature, the podcast. You can Google it and it should come up.
Wonderful.
There's a quick question for you, Jane. Lisa wants to know what's the title of your book again.
It's called Call Your Mother, with mother in quotes, because I'm quoting Black English, and a deliberately dirty-minded manifesto for the Earth Mother in the Anthropocene. It's Oxford University Press.
Yes, great book. I hope you all get a chance to read
Thank
it.
you.
Yes.
And your book, Janelle, and Stefanie's I've been reading, and it's so good. I highly recommend everybody run and get it. And Janelle has a book coming out too.
Yes.
Exciting. That's so exciting.
Yeah. That
it's
book I read, and it's awesome.
Well, thank you. It's called When God Lost Her Tongue, Historical Consciousness in the Black Feminist Imagination, kind of like what we all need right now.
What a
Yeah,
beautiful
okay.
title.
Thank
I
you.
love that title, Janelle.
Makes my heart dance. Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, we're doing all this good work, so I'm so glad to see it.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
Everyone. Thanks,
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye. I'll see you guys.